All right, what's going on, everybody? We're going to pick up where we left off in terms of talking about checks and balances in the last video lecture. But what this video is going to be all about is describing to you guys the several elements and aspects of the Constitution and this development of the new republic. And we're going to begin with a quote from Benjamin Franklin from 1787. He says, "Thus I consent, sir, to this Constitution. But I expect no better, and because I am not sure that it is not the best, the opinions I have had of its errors I sacrifice to the public good." With these words, Benjamin Franklin, the oldest delegate at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, attempted to overcome the skepticism of other delegates about the document that they had just created. Would the new document, the Constitution, establish a central government strong enough to hold 13 states together in a union that would prosper and endure? In 1787, of September of 1787, when Franklin, Washington, and other delegates signed the Constitution that they had drafted, the young country was in a troubled condition. In terms of what that troubled condition was, we have to talk about some of those key issues and some compromises that came out of this constitutional convention that will eventually give us what we know today, that is the U.S. Constitution document itself. So some key issues that the convention opened with in terms of delegates disagreeing was that they disagreed sharply on its foundation and the fundamental purpose for the government itself. Some wanted to simply revise the articles. Some nationalists, such as Madison and Hamilton, wanted to draft an entirely new document. The nationalists quickly took control of the convention, and by the 1780s, Americans in general distrusted government and feared that officials would eventually seize every opportunity to abuse their powers, even if they were popularly elected. Therefore, Madison and other delegates wanted to kind of use the new constitution to be based off of a system of checks and balances so that no branch would have more power than another and that they would all have checks on each other. So representation was a big thing in terms of making sure that both there was equal representation in this new government for both smaller and larger states. But it was especially divisive issue because larger states such as Virginia and Pennsylvania should have proportionally more representatives in Congress than smaller states such as New Jersey and Delaware. So Madison's proposal, that was the Virginia plan, favored large states that were largely countered by the New Jersey plan. And this New Jersey plan favored the smaller states. The issue was finally resolved by a compromise solution by Roger Sherman of Connecticut, who proposed that it would basically would be called necessarily like the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Plan, where it kind of blended both of these things. It provided for a two-house Congress in the legislative branch and in the Senate, states would have equal representation, but in the House of Representatives, each state would be representative of its size of population specific to that state. On the terms of slavery, two of the most contentious issues grew out of this topic. Should enslaved people be counted in the state populations? The delegates at this Constitution Convention agreed that the three-fifths compromise, which counted each enslaved individual as three-fifths of a person for the purposes of determining a state's level of taxation and representation, would eradicate some of those fears and some worries. But further questions came about in terms of should the slave trade still be allowed in the United States or this new society. The delegates decided eventually to guarantee that slaves could be imported for at least 20 years longer until 1808, and then Congress could vote to abolish the practice after that date if it wished. So what this Constitutional Convention eventually ended up bringing forth following ratification on September 17th of 1787 was that after 17 weeks of debate, the Philadelphia Convention approved a draft of the Constitution to submit to the states for ratification. They anticipated opposition to the document, so the framers specified, the delegates from this constitutional convention specified that a favorable vote of only 9 states out of 13 would be required for ratification. Each state would then hold their popularly elected conventions to debate and vote on the proposed constitution in each individual state, which eventually gave the atmosphere for the debate between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, something we're going to be talking about a lot with our Constitutional Convention assignment, to kind of start to bear fruit. Ratification was fiercely debated for almost a year, from September 1787 to June 1788, and supporters of the Constitution and its strong federal government were largely known as the Federalists, and the opponents were known as the Anti-Federalists. Federalists were most commonly along the Atlantic coast within the larger cities and the most dense populations, while the Anti-Federalists tended to be small farmers and settled on the western frontier. And what basically came about from this atmosphere of kind of division over how the government was going to be set up was that the Federalist Papers became a key element of the campaign for the Constitution. It was a series of highly persuasive essays written for a New York newspaper by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. And these 85 essays that were later published in book form as the Federalist Papers presented cognate reasons for believing in the practicality of each major provision of the Constitution. What would ultimately be the outcome is that the Federalists won early victories in the state conventions in Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, which were the first 3 states to ratify. But by promising to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, they successfully addressed the Anti-Federalists' most telling objection. With New Hampshire voting yes in June 1788, the Federalists won the necessary 9 states to achieve ratification of the Constitution. Even so, the larger states of Virginia and New York had not yet acted. If they failed to ratify, any chance for a national unity and strength would be in dire jeopardy. That further increases the need for unity among all of the colonies, or loosely states, still at this time period, to really unite behind this common goal of becoming a United States rather than a disunited States. So the structure of the United States Constitution kind of goes along as is outlined here. You have the preamble, which is more so the statement of purpose. You have the articles that establish the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And then you have the amendments to follow that are 27 in total, the first 10 being the Bill of Rights. So we're going to talk about several aspects and elements of this Constitution over the next few minutes. So let's begin with Article 1, that is the legislative branch. The legislative branch is largely establishing that there's a bicameral legislature, as we kind of talked about, with a great compromise between the Senate and the House of Representatives based on population, and then the Senate being 2 senators for each state, and that these representatives would serve for a total term of 2 years, and that senators would serve for 6-year terms. Important powers within the legislative branch rely on making laws, setting taxes, declaring wars, overriding vetoes, borrowing money, and also printing money. But when we get to the executive branch, things get a little bit differently. You have the president and vice president that are elected to 4-year terms and have to be 35 years old at least, and at least a 14-year resident of the United States, as well as being naturally born. But as chief executive, Washington's first task was to organize new departments of the executive branch. The Constitution authorizes the president to appoint chiefs in departments, although they must be confirmed or approved by the Senate, hence those checks and balances. But Washington appointed 4 heads of departments. That was Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as the Attorney General. And these 4 men formed a cabinet of advisors with whom President Washington met regularly to discuss major policy issues. And still today, presidents still meet with their cabinets to obtain advice and information. The third article is going to be talking about the judicial branch, in which Supreme Court judges serve for life, and that the judicial power rests with the U.S. Supreme Court and other courts that are also created by Congress. The only federal court that is mentioned in the Constitution is the Supreme Court, but Congress, like we had just discussed, has the power to create other federal courts with lesser powers and to determine the number of justices making up the Supreme Court. And one of the Congress's first laws was the Judiciary Act of 1789 that established that the Supreme Court with one Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices, and that this highest court was empowered to rule on the constitutionality of the decisions made by the lower state courts. And the act also provided for a system of 13 district courts and 3 circuit courts of appeals. So Article 3 is basically establishing that the U.S. Constitution gives power to some sort of a judicial branch. However, we will see that the judicial branch's power largely expands with judicial review coming later in 1803 in this case called Marbury versus Madison, which we will get to in a future video lecture. A couple other important articles to mention is that Article 5 addresses amendments, as well as Article 6 addressing federal power. But when we get to the Bill of Rights, that is talking about the first 10 amendments. In 1789, the first Congress that was elected under the Constitution acted quickly to adopt a number of amendments listing people's rights. This was drafted largely by James Madison. The amendments were submitted to the states for ratification. The 10 that were adopted in 1791 have been known ever since as the United States Bill of Rights. Originally, they provided protections against abuses of power by the central or federal government, but since the ratification of the 14th Amendment in 1868, most of the protections have been extended to apply to abuses by state governments as well. So below you have the actual text, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution that is considered the Bill of Rights that describes these in a bit more detail. And then you have the 13th through the 26th amendments that are identifying things about abolishing slavery, talking about prohibition, talking about women's suffrage, and also voting ages, and so on and so forth. So, in sum, you have federal law established by the United States Constitution's ratification, and in turn, we have what is now our modern day government that still exists in our society today. So with that, that's going to conclude us for today. What you're going to see pop up right about now is both a link to subscribe to my channel, but also another link to a crash course video on federalism that can help clear some of the air in terms of what's the difference between both states' rights and federal rights and the government that has just been established and outlined to you guys.